President, if I might speak to the amendment that I just proffered to the other side that was objected to, I think that there's a consensus here in the Senate that we need to fix some of these problems that we're facing, one of which is the expiration of unemployment insurance for people who are unemployed. There are a lot of tax provisions that are expiring that need to be extended, things like the research and development tax credit, which is critical to innovation and competitiveness in this country, and a whole range of other tax credits which affect a broad range of our economy. And also, I think it's important that we provide some certainty to people who depend upon federal policy, and one of those groups would be the physicians in this country who rely upon Medicare reimbursements for much of their survival, and because they treat so many Medicare patients. Many of the physicians, particularly in my area of the country, where we have a high elderly population, much of the patient base is Medicare. And obviously, physicians have been facing, up until last week, a 21% cut. That was addressed for 6 months. And so that we have fixed that. We have dealt with it for 6 months, but obviously that's an issue that comes up again. Now, what my amendment would have done would have solved that issue, not just for the next 6 months, but to the end of the year of 2012. So physicians in this country would have gotten an additional 2 years of relief, so to speak, with regard to this issue of their reimbursement. And so what I would suggest, Mr. President, is this, that inasmuch as these are all things that we agree need to be done, I think the real basic disagreement here revolves around how do we do that. Now, what the other side has put forward are a series of proposals, starting with the first one, which had $70 billion of tax increases and almost $80 billion added to the federal debt. Last week, the proposal was put forward by the Democrat majority, had $50 billion in tax increases and $55 billion added to the federal debt. We hope that this week we're going to see that slim down even further, and I would argue that we're making progress in the right direction. But it's still, I think, fair to say that these things need to be paid for. We have, as many of my colleagues have pointed out, $13 trillion in debt that we owe. Now, that includes debt that is owed between governmental agencies, we call intergovernmental debt, as well as debt held by the public. If you confine it just to debt held by the public, it's about $8.6 trillion. But remember, we're talking about trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And as my colleague from Tennessee just pointed out, it took 43 presidents 232 years to get to $5.8 trillion, which is what the amount of debt that we compiled and accumulated between 1776 and 2008, 232 years of American history, was $5.8 trillion. Now, under the President's budget, we will double, or we will equal that amount, I should say, in the next 5 years and double it in 10. In other words, we will double the federal debt today in 5 years and triple it in 10 years. That is an astounding, astounding number. If you think about all of American history, up until the year 2008, 232 years, 43 presidents, to get to $5.8 trillion, we are going to double that amount in 5 years and triple it in 10. Staggering. And under this new administration, we've already racked up enormous amounts of new debt because we added $1 trillion to the debt to pay for a stimulus bill, which has not shown any evidence of job creation other than jobs that have been created here in Washington, D.C. in the federal government level. Washington, I think you could argue, has benefited the economy here because we've created some government jobs, most of which are census jobs, some temporary jobs. But if you look at the overall job statistics, we've lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million jobs since the passage of the stimulus bill. We passed in health care expansion, which was sold as health care reform, but which frankly does very little to reform health care and certainly doesn't do anything consequential to reduce health care costs. I think most Americans now realize, as insurance premiums continue to go up, and as the actuary and the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Tax Committee all attest to the fact that you're going to see the cost curve bent up, not down, as a result of the passage of health care reform. A $2.5 trillion expansion over a 10-year period when it's fully implemented, that is a massive new entitlement program on top of the entitlement programs that are already bearing down on us and leading us toward a situation where in a very few years, if we don't take some serious steps, this country is going to be bankrupt. We're going to be belly up. It's as simple as that. You can't continue to sustain trillion-dollar deficits year after year after year after year, which is what we're facing now for the foreseeable and long-term future, and expect that we aren't going to completely drive this country into the ditch. And so what the amendment that I offered does is it pays for things. It says, let's change the way we do things around here. Let's quit handing the bill to our children and grandchildren. Let's quit putting it on the credit card and saying to the next generation, you pay this. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with the things that the other side is trying to accomplish. As I said, I think there's consensus about addressing these serious needs in our economy right now. But the difference of opinion here exists about how do you do that. All we're simply saying is, let's pay for things. Let's start doing something different here in Washington. Let's do what the American family has to do. Let's do what American small businesses have to do. Let's pay for things, for crying out loud. And I think that's what my amendment would do. It would say, here are some ways that we can shave some savings, that we can cut spending here in Washington, D.C., and do all these things that we think we ought to do without adding to the debt and without raising taxes in the process. A few months back, here in the United States Senate, we passed legislation which was labeled as historic. It passed to great fanfare. That it was called PAYGO legislation, and it created PAYGO rules that suggested that from now on we're going to start paying for things. Well, what's happened since the passage of PAYGO? The Senate has approved, if you count the not paid for portions of the bill that are on the floor right now, of course that hasn't been approved yet, but assuming it were, nearly $200 billion of new debt. From the time we said we're going to start paying for things, which was a few short months ago, we have waived the very rules that were going to put us on a path to fiscal responsibility and fiscal discipline, declared everything an emergency, and added almost $200 billion to the federal debt. So here we are today, debating again yet another measure that will add more to the federal debt, that will impose taxes on small businesses in our economy at a time when they are trying to get some momentum to help churn us out of this recession, get us back to where we're creating jobs and to a period of economic growth. And all we're doing is we're piling new taxes on them, taxes on investment, taxes on small businesses, and taxes, of course, with the recent passage of the health care bill, literally on everybody, because all of those tax increases are going to get passed on to the American consumer. So, where are we? Well, here's where we are. There are a number of things that can be done that would do what the other side wants to do, to pay for the extension of unemployment benefits, one of which would be we could save the necessary amount of money to pay for this. Now, the cost of extending unemployment benefits in the Democrat proposal, by the way, Mr. President, is $33 billion. Now, that's a substantial amount of money, but there are many ways in which that could be paid for, all of which was included in my amendment last week. But let me suggest a couple discrete parts of that amendment that might be stripped out and used to pay just for this unemployment insurance. We could pay for the extension of the unemployment benefits by returning unspent stimulus funds, which would save $34.5 billion. So $33 billion in unemployment benefits that could need to be extended to people who have lost jobs in the recession could be paid for by returning unspent stimulus funds to the tune of $34.5 billion. So there would be enough to pay for the unemployment benefits, some left over. Could also be paid for through a 5% cut to 2010 appropriations and an expansion of the affordability exemption to the individual mandate in the health care reform law, which together would save $33.5 billion. So that would give you the $33 billion that would be necessary to pay for the extension of unemployment benefits. Alternatively, it could be paid for with the rescission of other unspent federal funds, which would pay for it by saving $56 billion. So you could take care of the unemployment benefits, you'd have the $33 billion that's necessary to pay for that, and $23 billion left over, hopefully be put toward the federal debt, which would be the best thing that we could do for our children and grandchildren. Now finally, it could also be paid for with the inclusion in this bill of medical malpractice reform, which was also included in my amendment last week. That would save about $50 billion. So you'd have $50 billion to pay for the $33 billion in unemployment benefits and have $17 billion left over to put toward the federal debt, which again would be the best thing that we could do for our children and grandchildren. So all these arguments that are made by my Democrat colleagues that these things are draconian just isn't true. These are common sense things that would give us the necessary resources to take care of the problem that is in front of us today, but do it in a way that doesn't add billions and billions and billions of dollars to the federal debt, exacerbating what is already a very serious circumstance facing our children and grandchildren, which the senator from Tennessee did a very good job of outlining. If you're a child under 18 in America today, the amount of the debt that you own is about $85,000. By the year 2017, that's going to be $196,000. So if you are in America today, you're a young person in America today who is under the age of 18, your share of the federal debt is $85,000. And 10 years from now, that's going to be $196,000. In fact, less than 10 years from now, in the year 2017. All that leaves us with a very, I think, clear choice when it comes to how we solve problems here in Congress, here in the Senate, and how we deal with the question before us this evening, the immediate question, and that is, how do we extend unemployment benefits to those who've lost jobs in the recession? Well, the other side has come forward with a proposal, again, with billions and billions and billions of dollars. It's not paid for, that does go on the debt, that does get passed on to our children and grandchildren. What we're offering up are some common sense ways, which mean that the Congress and that the federal government may have to live on a little bit less, things that would require the federal government to go on a diet, if you will, in the same way that the American people are having to go on a diet, because the American people are being asked to, because of this tough economy, to make hard choices with regard to their family budgets, with regard to their individual and their personal lifestyles, with regard to their businesses. Everybody in this country is having to make decisions about cutting back a little bit. We could address this issue by just asking the federal government to take a little bit of a haircut, put the federal government on a little bit of a diet, and we can achieve the savings that are necessary to pay for the proposal that is before us. As I said, $33 billion fixes the unemployment benefit issue, and I've just named 1, 2, 3, 4 ways that could be paid for with money left over that could be put toward the federal debt. That's what this is about. That's the discussion here. It's very straightforward. My colleagues on the other side have come up here this evening and will continue to offer unanimous consent requests to go ahead and do this but not pay for it. And people on our side are getting up and saying, wait a minute, no, I object, and here's why. The reason is why is because we believe in a very straightforward way that we ought to start doing what I think the American people expect of us, and that is for us to live within our means in the same way that they do. And unfortunately, regrettably today, Mr. President, that is not what's happening here in the United States Congress. Year over year over year, we continue to spend and spend and spend and borrow and borrow and borrow like there is no tomorrow. Well, the chickens are going to come home to roost. Someday the bills have to be paid. People where I come from in South Dakota understand that. There is no free lunch. When you borrow money, it has to be paid back, and you can't spend money that you don't have. Those are all things that are happening here in Washington, D.C. today. We're spending money we don't have. We are borrowing money we don't have any idea about how we're going to pay back. All we're simply doing is giving it to the next generation so that they'll have a bill facing them and a future that will shackle them with debt that they will be dealing with for their lifetimes and probably in the lives of their children and grandchildren as well. Just by way of illustration, because I think it's important to put things into perspective, and sometimes I think that it's very difficult to come to grips with, what is $1 billion, what's $1 million, what's $1 trillion, and so I tried to break that down, and I just to kind of put it in perspective for myself, so I can understand a little bit better what we're talking about, because the numbers sometimes and the number of zeros on the end of that number can be almost mind-boggling to the average person in this country, and most of us aren't used to dealing with numbers that are in the that ballpark of $1 trillion. So what is 1 trillion seconds? If you took 1 trillion seconds, what would that translate into? Just by way of illustration, by way of example. 1 trillion seconds, if you broke that down into years, would be over 31,000 years, almost 32,000 years, 31,746 years is what 1 trillion seconds is. So if you took, you take $1 trillion and you make a second $1 and try and put it into terms that I think the average American can understand, 1 trillion seconds represents 31,746 years. Now, since most of us here are probably not going to live much more than 80 years, I mean, hopefully, if we're lucky, we live beyond that. but most of us here are going to live under 100 years. And when you talk about 1 trillion seconds, which in the last now we've just seen about 15 seconds passed here, and you think up, if you add that up to 1 trillion, that's 31,746 years. So just think about what $1 trillion represents, how much that is, the scale and the dimension that we're talking about, and what we are doing to future generations of Americans if we don't start taking the steps that are necessary to pay the bills around here. So this is the amendment that I offered and that was objected to by the other side would have done that. It would have fixed the physician fee issue, not just until November of this year, but for another 2 years beyond that to the end of the year 2012. It would have addressed the issue of these expiring tax provisions, which we're all concerned about. There's some important tax policy that needs to be extended that's expired and needs to be addressed. And there is also, as I said earlier, of course, the issue before us this evening of unemployment benefits, which at a cost of $33 billion could easily be offset by any number of the things that I've suggested this evening. I see my colleague from Utah has arrived on the floor. I know that he too has an amendment that he would like to offer up that I think makes a lot of sense when it comes to creating jobs. He's someone who has a small business background, understands what job creation is all about, and I suspect that he will have a request that he will make of our colleagues on the other side as well. And so I would, at this point, Mr. President, yield back the balance of my time.